It's spooky season again, right here on the Paperback Warrior podcast. My name is Eric, and I'm single handedly dragging you, my faithful listener, through the hallways of dark castles, up shadowy staircases of secluded mansions, and a terror filled peek at a mountain of vintage paperback books. This show is an offshoot of the Paperback Warrior blog, where you'll find 106 prior episodes of the show, along with thousands of reviews of vintage fiction across multiple genres. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and X. Also, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm putting a lot of emphasis on our channel with loads and loads of video shorts showing you book covers and brief reviews. Plus, each of these podcast episodes has a companion video of my most recent shopping trips or just unusual finds in the wild. This very episode has a video, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But first, let me tell you what I have on tap for this episode. Today's feature is on a mysterious Canadian writer named William Edward Daniel Ross. He used a lot of pseudonyms over the course of his writing career, with the most famous being Marilyn Ross. He is what many consider the king of Gothic romance paperbacks, but he wrote over 350 novels in genres like romance, science fiction, westerns, and the aforementioned Gothic romance. He also wrote over 600 short stories. His career and personal life is just really bizarre and unusual, and I can't wait to tell you all about it. Also, today I'm reviewing a vintage horror paperback from 1990 titled Thrill. It was written by popular horror scribe Patricia Wallace. In addition, I'm going to read to you a short story by one of my favorite writers. It's called The King of Horror, and it was authored by Stephen Mertz. But before we get to all that, I'm dying to tell you about my visit to North Carolina. So a few episodes ago, I was explaining that my family members and loved ones seem to be dying left and right. I really hate cancer. Everywhere I look, I just find someone I know or loved is dealing with it. So my wife received some very bad news regarding one of our close family members. So we decided we needed to just get away for a few days, just the two of us. So we drove up from Florida to Virginia, we did some hiking, and visited my parents and friends, and it was great. On the way back to Florida, we chose to stay in a bed and breakfast in Fayetteville, North Carolina. So, trying to find the place, I was just looking around as my wife is speeding through the city, and I see a very small plaza with a tiny parking lot that says, BJ's to used books. White sign, blue letters. I mean, this place is so small that it was like 2 blocks before I could even emphasize to my wife that she just drove past a used bookstore, which is something that absolutely can't happen. She was happy to turn around and drive back, and we pull up to this little plaza that looks like it might be, I don't know, like a pool supply store or something on the left, and then the bookstore is on the right side of the building. The parking lot was virtually empty, but it's a Sunday of all things, and what was interesting is the door was just wide open. We just pull up, doors wide open, strange plaza, pool supplies, books, go figure. At first I thought it was an abandoned building, but the building, it's not in really great shape, so I was kind of worried about it. But anyway, we go inside, and there's a guy that says hi to me, and I assume he's a co-owner. He was very nice. I took a quick look around and immediately knew this was my kind of place. It was your kind of place. I don't mean this as an insult to the owners of the bookstore, but the place is a complete wreck with books stacked on top of books and boxes stacked on boxes, just sort of sitting around everywhere. These are the bookstores that I actually like. If they're too clean with everything just neatly organized and I see a bunch of new hardcovers, chances are I'm probably not going to find anything there unless that store owner is into what I'm into and they've purposely handcrafted their store to look organized where I can find everything, then that's okay. But chances are if everything's organized and maybe they have a cat or something, that's probably not going to have what we need. But anyway, this place had some mileage and it showed severely. So my wife strikes up a conversation with a woman who co-owns the store, and again, she's really, really nice. She explains in a lot of detail that the bookstores like hers are really few and far between these days, and the building, it no longer has any power. Apparently the building, I guess, may be condemned at some point and the city wants her out. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a fire trap, but I could definitely see some issues in there with maybe codes and stuff. However, I don't care because this is my kind of place. It has a hoarder vibe to it, and it was just overwhelming with all of the books. But it's good, it's good, it's good, good. I journeyed into the belly of the beast and found the first set of shelves dedicated to the executioner types of books. I find sometimes that's the easiest approach to find mysteries and crime fiction and things like that is by first locating the men's action adventure section. I do that by trying to find the executioner books or the Clive Cussler books. And if push comes to shove, I'll start looking for Tom Clancy for God's sake. I won't go into this too deep because I took loads and loads of photos of this store and the books and the covers, and I have all of them in a companion video to this episode. But I will say that if you're into books published in paperback between 1970 and 1990 that feature vigilantes, team commandos, post-apocalyptic fiction, military fiction, we're talking books in series titles like Kung Fu Mace, Liberty Corps, Fu Manchu, Soldier of Fortune, Denison's War, The Zone, The Guardians, Road Blaster, God help you, Overload, Hell Rider, Tiger Shark, Matt Helm, The Last Ranger, Phoenix Force, Horse Clans. I would venture to say that other than Chamberlain's Book Mine here in Jacksonville, Florida, this store is a close second. There were so many spy books and prisoner of war books, like loads and loads of paperbacks which cover combat or have covers with people in combat. And it wasn't just that particular niche. The store was also stacked with books like Mike Shane, books by John D. MacDonald, hard case crime novels. They had Edgar Rice Burroughs vintage paperbacks along with vintage Doc Savage paperbacks and Michael Moorcock paperbacks. Some of those were in sets in big bags, so you had to buy them as like trilogies. They had a great selection of novelizations. There's an entire shelving unit, both front and back, dedicated to vintage horror paperbacks. I mean, they had Ross MacDonald books. They had a section just for Sherlock Holmes. Just to give you an idea of how deep their collection is, they had rare books that we've reviewed right here on Paperback Warrior, like The Town That Saw No Evil by Harry Cantor. Tom reviewed that book. A Piece of This Country by Thomas Taylor. I reviewed that book. And The Captain Must Die by Robert Colby, which Tom reviewed. This isn't just your everyday run-of-the-mill stuff. They also had a lot of vintage gothic romance paperbacks and a great selection of Mary Stuart paperbacks. Below the shelving units were boxes and boxes of stacked paperbacks. I just pulled one box out just to take a quick glance and saw books by Clark Howard and Jack Higgins. Again, you need to watch my video to understand what kind of books this place has. It's uncanny. The things that threw me off was that seemingly one half of the store's front portion is off limits. I could clearly see what looked like hundreds of paperbacks in stacks on tables or on shelving units, but the owner said she hasn't had time to look through all of those yet. Let me tell you, I hate it when used booksellers tell me this, because chances are I'll go there a year from now and those same books will be sitting there with the same explanation. I just haven't had time to go through them yet. I see this as habitual behavior from used booksellers all the time. She also informed me she has boxes of vintage Gothic paperbacks to put out, so maybe someday they'll be on the shelves for sale. The other thing that I didn't quite understand or didn't really like was the prices. They varied from $3 to $8. I couldn't really obtain a sense of what made a paperback more expensive than another. I will say the vintage horror paperbacks I pulled out were priced rather high, but maybe not as high as some I've seen on eBay, especially considering the paperbacks from hell price hike we've seen over the last few years. Again, I have a video companion of this episode you can watch on YouTube right now of all the books and the book covers I saw in the store. It's worth watching. Included in that video is the stack of paperbacks I bought as well. Be sure to check it out, and also please subscribe to the channel. I'm growing it by leaps and bounds, and I need your help to get there. All right, now that I've taken you through stacks of books in Fayetteville, North Carolina, it's time to switch you to a Canadian basement to bring you this author feature. I'm going to hit the tune for us. Stay tuned. Okay, so the first thing you need to know is that William Edward Daniel Ross was a best-selling Canadian novelist that wrote more than 350 novels using a variety of pseudonyms. Chances are, if you see a Gothic romance paperback in a used bookstore, there's a very high probability it was written by Ross. I wanted to dig into his career and life because he was just so prolific, and I have read certain things about him through the years concerning how he would write, how he supposedly chained himself to a typewriter, how he had a basement dungeon, and so forth. I really just wanted to get the story straight, and I think I've done that. So, Ross was born in 1912 in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada. He moved to the United States in 1934 and studied at Provincetown Playhouse in New York. It's in 1934 that Ross won a Dominion Drama Festival Prize for acting. He went on to study creative writing at University of Oklahoma, Columbia University, and University of Chicago. He managed a traveling production company and created his own theater company called Maritime Theater Players, which he ran between 1937 and 1942. In the 1930s, Ross also wrote and acted in radio dramas, including those produced by the Canadian Broadcast Corporation. During World War II, Ross served with the British Entertainment Services Division. After the war, he co-founded the Capitol Sounds Film Company, which distributed films into the late 1950s. In 1944, he married Charlotte McCormick, who had become his writing partner for a short time. Ross's first published literary work was a short story titled The Pearls of Li Pong. It was in the February 1957 issue of Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine. His second published story was A Perfect Ending, which was in the November 1957 issue of that same magazine. So Ross really gets going here and starts churning out short stories for magazines like the Saint Detective Magazine, the Saint Mystery Magazine, Mystery Digest, Mike Shane Mystery Magazine, London Mystery Selection, and so forth. Of these stories, both Ross and his wife collaborated on a series titled Mr. Mewong. That's spelled M like Mary, E like elephant, I like igloo, space, Wong. Their collaboration was on the series stories, all collected in the Saint Mystery Magazine, and the UK version as well, between 1958 through 1964. However, Ross's wife Charlotte died in 1959, but what they had wrote together was published in 1963 and 1964. But I wanted to stop here just for a minute and go over this Mr. Mewong series. So there were 29 total Mr. Mewong stories published between 1958 through 1977. As I mentioned previously, Ross's wife co-wrote the series, but her contribution was just 4 stories. The rest were all penned by Ross using the name W.E.D. Ross. These stories appeared in the magazines The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Chase, The Saint Mystery, Mike Shane Mystery, and The Saint Mystery UK. The premise of the series is that Mr. Mewong is an artist, a painter, that lives in Bombay, India, which today is called Mumbai. He runs the Bombay Art and Curio Shop. The idea is that Wong assists the police in capturing art thieves and other criminals preying on the Bombay population. The other main character of the series is Inspector Banerjee. Wong is always a wise old man in this series and comes up with interesting ways to solve crimes. So in a way, it's kind of like a detective series. For example, in a Mike Shane Mystery Magazine story from 1970, Wong is in his studio painting when an armed intruder barges in and says he will now kill Wong. The explanation is that Wong assisted the police to put him in prison, and now he's out for revenge. Wong gingerly explains to the intruder that he would like the time just to finish the painting. The intruder gives him the time that he needs. Just as he's about to pull the trigger, Wong tells the intruder that he would be willing to provide him an ultimate treasure if he could just watch the sunset one more time. The intruder, hoping for some sort of huge payout here, allows it. Just as the sun sets, Inspector Banerjee storms into the place and arrests the intruder. The intruder wants to know what the treasure was going to be. Wong explains to the intruder that he did give him a wonderful treasure. By allowing him to see the sunset, he was able to prevent the intruder from becoming a murderer. That was the gift that no amount of money could purchase. Pretty clever. Ross would have 65 short stories published throughout his writing career under his own name. However, according to the New Brunswick Literary Encyclopedia, they state that Ross actually wrote over 600 short stories. Other publications include The Link, Highway Patrolman, Daily News, Canadian Messenger, The Roundup, and so forth. The only other series title I could locate was Sister Julia, which she appeared in just 2 stories that I could find. I have no information on this Sister Julia character. Between Ross and his wife, they collaborated on 100 short stories, or even more than that, maybe. Now, let's get down to books and pseudonyms. The first pseudonym I can find Ross using was that of Olin Ross, Olin. He used it to write his first published novel, The Case of the Naked Driver, which was published by Art Enterprises in 1961 when Ross was 49 years old. He was recognized for Best First Novel in Canada with the Gibson National Literary Award. He followed that with another novel written using the Olin Ross name called Lust Planet. It was published in France in 1962, and it's a sleaze novel, adults only. That takes care of the Olin Ross pseudonym, just those 2 books. However, an article online stated that his first published novel was Summer Season in 1962, written under the name Jane Rossiter. I was able to find further information that suggests that Summer Season was published in the fall of 1962, but it appears that The Case of the Naked Driver was published prior to this. I'm not sure what his first published book was, but it certainly seems like The Case of the Naked Driver is it. Next is the pseudonym of Dan Roberts. This is a name that Ross used to write westerns for the American library market. Publishers like Robert Hale, Arcadia House, and Avalon Books. Titles like Wyoming Showdown, Outlaw's Gold, Vengeance Rider, Yuma Brand, and so forth. He authored 14 Western books between 1961 through 1970 for publishers like Arcadia House and Tower. I think at least one of these books was reprinted by Leisure. I think it was called Sheriff of Mad River. I've never read a Western by Ross, but according to the excellent blog written by author James Reasoner, they seem to be very generic but entertaining Westerns. Now we move over to his pseudonym Jane Rossiter. He used this name to write romance novels. Not to be confused with gothic romance. These are just traditional romance novels. He wrote 6 of these books using the Jane Rossiter name between 1962 and 1967 for publishers like Ballantine Books, Ballantine, and McFadden Bartell. If you dig nurse fiction, one of these books fits that niche. Backstage Nurse from 1963. Okay, so speaking of nurses, that opens up a whole new segment of this feature on Ross. If you will recall, Ross's wife Charlotte died in 1959. In 1960, Ross returned to Canada and he married Marilyn Ann Clark. He was married to her until his death in 1995. Now, Clark worked as a nurse, and she also served as Ross's agent and proofreader. I noticed that Ross began writing nurse fiction around the time that he married Marilyn Clark. As Ellen Randolph, the author wrote 5 novels from 1963 through 1983 of nurse fiction. Some of the titles were Nurse of the North Woods, Nurse Martha's Wish, The Haunting of Nurse Jean. Then we really get into some nurse fiction with Ross using the pseudonym Anne Gilmer. He wrote 17 paperbacks of nurse fiction with titles like Nurse Crane Emergency, Nurse in the Tropics, Private Nurse, Nurse on Call, Skyscraper Nurse, and Celebrity Nurse. Using the name Rose Williams, Ross wrote 5 paperbacks starring nurses, with titles like Five Nurses, Airport Nurse, Nurse in Doubt. Using the pseudonym of Rose Dana, Ross authored 23 novels, with most appearing to be nurse fiction. Titles like Nightclub Nurse, Arctic Nurse, Nurse in Jeopardy, and Resort Nurse. Right now, we're at like 50 books of nurse fiction. But we aren't done yet, folks. As Ruth Dorset, Ross wrote 8 nurse novels with titles like Hotel Nurse, Front Office Nurse, and Behind Hospital Walls. So, roughly 60 nurse paperbacks before we even consider the nurse books that Ross wrote using the name W.E.D. Ross. Just from glancing at titles, I see 11 books with hospital or nurse in the title. That's 62 books about nurses. Not to mention that a lot of his gothic romance paperbacks featured nurses as main characters. Ross marrying a nurse may have pushed him into this niche market, or maybe he was just trying to overtake nurse fiction author star Peggy Gaddis. I think she was averaging like a book a month. Ross also was writing nurse short stories that appeared in publications like Hospital Romances. Now, before we just go completely gothic crazy, let's finish out the rest of the pseudonyms that aren't necessarily gothic related. As Tex Steele, Ross wrote 3 Western novels between 1968 and 1969. As Charlotte McCormick, which was his first wife's name, he wrote 2 books from 1966 to 1967. He wrote 1 novel in 1968 using the name Miriam Leslie, and he wrote 2 romance novels using the name Jan Daniels in 1966. He wrote a romance novel in 1987 using the name Marilyn Carter. He wrote another one in 1981 using the name Diane Randall. Okay, so we have all that out of the way. Let's get into the gothic craziness and then get into his crazy writing life. All right, so Gothics. His Gothics were published under the names Dan Ross, W.E.D. Ross, Clarissa Ross, Marilyn Ross, Dana Ross, Lydia Colby, and Laura Frances Brooks. His publishers included Paperback Library, Avon, Curtis Books, Lancer, Leisure, Manor, Pyramid, and Magnum. As W.E.D. Ross, he authored about 20 gothic romance novels. Maybe more, I'm just going off of the titles that sound like they're goth. As Clarissa Ross, he authored another 40 gothic romance novels. Also, as Clarissa Ross, he authored a 6-book series called Dark Harbor from 1974 to 1975. Then, as Marilyn Ross, he authored another 48 gothic romance novels from the 1960s through the 1980s. Under the same Marilyn Ross name, he wrote the Fog Island series, which was 7 books between 1965 and 1978. He wrote The Stewards of Stormhaven, which was a 12-book series between 76 and 78. The Birthstone Gothic series, which was 3 books in 1975. And, of course, his most well-known literary work, and that's the Dark Shadows series, which lasted 32 books between 1966 and 1972. I'm going to briefly touch on just a handful of Ross books I've read. My first one was Fog Island from Paperback Library, 1965. Young Stella Trent is invited by her distant grandmother to visit this island on the coast of New Brunswick, Canada. There, she's attacked by what appears to be a ghostly apparition. She's told the house is haunted. She also learns that her aunt and a man died there in a mysterious drowning. The mystery is whether or not her aunt really died or is being held captive in a neighboring laboratory. I really enjoyed the book. I liked the main character, and of course, the atmosphere was great. I read Dark Legend from 1966, also on Paperback Library. The story takes place in the late 1800s in a large lakeside mansion in Maine. Jan is the main character, and she wakes up with amnesia. That's a common trope, right? And must determine how she arrived at the mansion and who she really is. There's a crazy psycho with vicious dogs, and there's also a rumor that a masked man wearing black gloves haunts the area. There's a mystery about her dead mother and this weird neighbor. The book was just okay, and it had a heightened level of suspense to really keep things moving. I read Phantom Manor from 1965 on Paperback Library. It's set in the 1800s in a coastal manor situated on a small peninsula. When the tide rises, the manor is cut off from the mainland completely, which plays a part in the book. Again, this character's name is Jan. I don't know why he keeps using Jan. She's invited by her distant grandfather to visit the house after her father dies. There's this land feud there between her grandfather and these monks, and there's a mystery regarding the murder of a monk. There's this idea that a ghost haunts the area. I thought the book was really dull, and too much time was spent on Jan and her relationship with her distant cousin, and the hiring and firing of staff around the house. It was a real chore to sit through. I read The Heidi Circle from Pyramid from 1976. A woman named Agnes is suffering from the recent loss of her mother. After a nervous breakdown, she journeys to Haiti for vacation. She falls in love with a doctor, and then there's rumors of voodoo rituals on the island, obviously. Agnes is targeted by the voodoo cult, and she's got things like tarantulas and bats showing up in her bedroom as some sort of curse. I thought this book was actually pretty darn good. It had a spooky overall vibe to it. I felt like the book contained a real, maybe supernatural element to it. I read The Secret of Mallet Castle, reprinted by Manor in 1977, from an original publication on Arcadia House back in 1966. Now, Eve is a nurse working in Ohio, and she finds out she's inherited a fortune from a distant relative in Cape Cod. This stuff never happens to me. I'm probably going to inherit debt. Anyway, Eve goes to Cape Cod, gets the ownership of this large house, begins dealing with the house staff, and begins feuding with her uncle's wife. She falls in love with a surgeon. Eve was one of the stronger characters I've experienced in a Ross novel. I just loved how she took charge of things. She really had a supreme confidence in dealing with danger. She even uses a gun, which is like the first for me in a Gothic. This one was good. I read Message from a Ghost from Paperback Library in 1971. In this book, Gail experiences the death of her wealthy father and journeys to Connecticut to mourn with her sister Emily. Gail then takes a vacation at a resort where she ends up being involved with a local mobster. The book's second half is spent as Gail is a prisoner in an old abandoned theater with some really frightening captors. There's this possibility of a dead actress that haunts the place. This one was really good, and it combined crime fiction with the traditional Gothic element. It made it really unique. I really, really liked this book. I also read Dark of the Moon from 1969 on McFadden Bartell and thought it was just meh. Julia experiences crazy phenomenon in a mansion, and she's nearly killed multiple times. Is her husband a psycho? Is his mother a psycho? This was just okay. I didn't really enjoy it that much. I also read the first two installments of the Dark Shadows series. The first book, titled Dark Shadows, was really dull as the main character, Victoria, settles into Colin's house in Collinsport, Maine, to care for a kid. Now, obviously, this is tying into the famous ABC vampire soap opera series that ran in the 70s. She's nearly killed multiple times, but the book's pace was so slow and there was just so much pointless dialogue. I disliked this book, but thankfully the second book, which is titled Victoria Winters, works more like a mystery or crime noir as three guests spend a few weeks at the Collins house. There's a mysterious woman in the house that no one can see other than Victoria, and she may be a dead woman named Stella. There's also a mysterious painter hanging around that seems to have a secret agenda. This was a really good crime fiction mystery with atmosphere. It was rather slow, but it all had a point, and it added to the storytelling. I loved this book. Despite Ross's incredible volume of books, he did receive rejections often. He routinely received rejections from Robert Hale. He was asked to make many edits for his books, like a stepmom's too mean or a doctor's too sadistic. His settings would sometimes throw off the publishers. For example, his novel Castle on the Hill is set in Canada. Avalon published the book, but U.S. magazine Redbook rejected it. There were interesting reasons behind books being published and those that weren't. Like Carol Plain, who was the editor for Pyramid at the time, she considered Ross's atmosphere to be the most important element of his books. By 1966, Plain began to reject some of Ross's Gothic outlines, claiming that it just didn't conform to her expectations. On the other hand, Paperback Library editor Sue Rosenberg identified other elements as being important: a gloomy house, a spunky young woman whose life is threatened while being a resident in the gloomy old house, a harboring mystery, a love interest for the heroine, a brooding master burdened in some way. Robert Hale refused Ross's Gothic outlines due to their feelings that English readers preferred straightforward romances or mysteries. While Pyramid stopped accepting Ross's Gothics, Paperback Library was all in on Ross. They hired him to write the Dark Shadows novels, which by mid-1969 had already sold more than 205 million copies. On Ross's personal life, things get a little crazy. All right, so it's one of the reasons why I actually chose to present this feature. So, according to an interview published on May 10th, 1969 in Weekend magazine, Ross stated that he would take 24 hours after finishing a book to begin the next book. He said he couldn't afford to waste any time with another promise to deliver another novel before the end of the month. He also went on to say that the short stories also had to be turned out every single week. He said he's not complaining and that the writing is going well. Think about that for a second. He's writing nearly nonstop his entire life. As of 1969, the article about Ross states that he wrote 115 novels and had 600 stories published just in a 7-year period of time. The New York Times Book Review once called him, quote, one of the most formidable writing factories in this or any other hemisphere, unquote. In that same article, Ross is quoted as saying, I'm probably Canada's most read unknown writer, but that's because I use so many pen names. Editors insist on them for my different types of novels and because I was producing for so many publishers. As a result, I may have 8 books on a newsstand, and not one of them with my own name. I'm Rose Dana and Rose Williams for the nurse books. Marilyn Ross, that's my wife's name, for the Gothic mysteries involving a heroine and the setting of an old castle or remote ancient mansion. Dan Roberts and Tex Steele for westerns. Then for the modern novels, romances, and general mysteries, I'm Ellen Randolph, Jane Daniels, Jane Rossiter, Clarissa Ross, Ruth Dorset, Leslie Ames, W.E.D. Ross, W.E. Dan Ross, and Dan Ross, unquote. The article says that a veteran New York literary agent by the name of Donald McCampbell called Ross on a Monday morning and said he needs a nurse book and that they're in a bit of a rush. Ross said he would get right to it. He put aside his mystery novel and then wrote a nurse novel. The agent said that he had 300 typed pages, which was the manuscript for a 75,000-word nurse novel delivered to his desk the following Monday. Supposedly, that same book, again written in just 1 week's time, sold 250,000 copies. So, how does one write this many books? How does a writer gain this much patience to write? Gain the allegiance of countless editors and publishers? Have the discipline to stay at home with a typewriter banging away manuscripts seemingly every single hour of the day? Here's how Ross did it. This is extraordinary. So here's his jam. Ross placed himself in a wood-paneled, soundproofed basement room about 9 feet square. He worked seated on a small sofa with his typewriter in his lap. He would go into this writing room after breakfast. He would read his mail, look after business affairs until 11 a.m. He then begins to write. He takes a short break for lunch, goes back to writing nonstop until 7 p.m. He stops to have dinner. He goes for a short walk, about 3 minutes, with his dog. He then returns to the writing room and writes nonstop until midnight. By that time, he has typed 10,000 words. And the kicker is, he doesn't type. He used the 2-finger approach. That's insane to me. That just blows my mind. Now, why all that is happening? His wife Marilyn's upstairs editing the nurse books because she's a nurse. She also takes the phone calls and does background research for all of his books. He described his wife by saying, she keeps my characters' names straight. I'm always getting their names mixed up. Sybil, the heroine in my current book, suddenly becomes Elsie, who was the heroine in my last book. That sort of thing. When asked if he is a hack, Ross responded, I honestly don't think I am a hack. A true hack is motivated entirely by money, and I'm not. Of course, I do make a lot of money, as much as a successful business executive, but I've never written anything that was not sincere. I write primarily to express my viewpoint on life and to entertain. As an entertainer, I write escapist fiction. And what's wrong with escapism? You eat a meal to escape hunger. You read a novel of mystery or romance to escape boredom or worry, unquote. Some controversy arose when an American tourist in England picked up one of his novels in a bookstore. It bore his name as the author. On her trip home, she bought another book with the author's name as Jane Rossiter, but the book was the exact same thing. One is Ross, one with a different title as Rossiter. So she decides she's going to write Ross a letter, and in the letter, she said that this is a case of literary theft and that this Jane Rossiter person has stolen Ross's book. Ross said he responded to her by thanking her. He sent her some free books, but he said it was much simpler than trying to explain to her that I can't sue myself. In a New York Times interview dated April 7, 1975, Ross said, "Of course I write the same story over and over. I'm writing for a market, and I give my readers what they want. I like to think of them as the successors to the pulp readers of 30 or 40 years ago." When describing his characters, Ross said, "The heroine in distress must always be innocent and beautiful, and she must always be sympathetic and good. How I'd love to write about a bitchy heroine sometime," unquote. In that same interview, Ross explained that he was earning about $1,000 per week. As a side note to that statement, Ross was paid $750 to $800 for a reprint from Paperback Library, and they paid him $1,000 for original paperbacks. As their relationship prospered, Paperback Library would increase their payment to $1,500 and then $1,750. Lancer paid $1,000 to Arcadia for a reprint of one of Ross's nurse romances. Other interesting tidbits here before I finish this up. Ross also wrote 12 plays. He starred in a film called As Young as You Feel in 1950. He appeared on the CBS game show To Tell the Truth on January 31, 1966. That episode is available on YouTube, so if you want to see what this guy looked like and what he sounded like, you can watch that episode. Again, it's called To Tell the Truth on January 31, 1966. He appeared on Late Night with David Letterman on April 1st, 1987, alongside singer Dolly Parton. The topic was the amount of books that Ross wrote. The New Brunswick Consortium of professional writers named Ross Canada's most prolific writer. He earned the Queen Elizabeth Silver Jubilee Medal for writing in 1978, and he earned an honorary doctorate from the University of New Brunswick in 1988. According to Boston University's papers, Ross maintained a correspondence with author Michael Avallone, W.S. Campbell, and Kurt Singer. Ross was published in 22 countries and in 13 different languages. His 100th book was Behind Locked Shutters, and the message at the beginning of the book says, "To my wife Marilyn, novel 100." On average, his books sold 750,000 copies, making him an example of a best-selling author, with cumulative sales being enormous. He received recognition from Guinness Book of World Records for the number of books he wrote. Now, you can listen to a ton of audiobooks by Ross. Paperback Classics has The Dark Shadows available on Audible, and you can also buy each book on CD, with the narrator being Catherine Lee Scott. She's great. The non-Dark Shadows Gothics are read by Romy Nordlinger. What I love about these is that they all chose to keep the original artwork of the paperbacks. They look very cool. I can listen to the Ross novels for free using the Hoopla app. I just log in with my local public library credentials, and I've got like 15 of them sitting there. Hopefully this episode sort of authenticates some of the things that I've heard about Ross through the years, and maybe you've heard about Ross as well, about his career and strange writing habits and things like that. So hopefully this sets the record straight. My sources for this feature was Boston University's W.E. Dan Ross collection of papers, the New Brunswick Library Encyclopedia, the Toronto Reference Library blog, Collinsport Historical Society, and an amazing essay titled William Edward Daniel Ross's Transformation into a Popular Fiction Novelist, 1962 to 1967, by Janet Friskney. Alright, on to today's review. I chose to read a vintage horror paperback by Patricia Wallace called Thrill. It was published in 1990 by Zebra. Wallace was a really popular author, and she saw her first book published in 1982 called Traces. Her horror novels typically feature kids, so this book I read, again titled Thrill, features kids. Here's what I was thinking this book was about going into the first page. I was thinking this book was about kids who are trapped inside of a high-tech giant amusement park where the robots and props have malfunctioned, forcing them into a do-or-die type of escape. Yeah, I was thinking like Chopping Mall. Remember that old 80s horror flick where the robots are killing all the people in the mall? Or maybe like Westworld, where the androids go crazy and start killing the attendants? Or even something like Jurassic Park, where I guess the security's breached, the fences come down, the dinosaurs are running around, and the people are trying to escape. Does Thrill deliver this? No. No, it does not. This book sucks, and I'll tell you why. This billionaire developer named Sheldon Rice builds this 1,000-acre amusement park in rural California, complete with robot soldiers, robot spiders, and creatures. It's like a combination of being scared to death and having the best time of your life. That's the idea of the park, which is what it's cleverly called. Rice decides to do a Willy Wonka type of thing and send out special invitations to kids to come experience the park on its grand opening to the public. Great! But the author spends entire chapters introducing each kid, and there's like 6 or 7 of them, and what their backstory is. That's fine as long as there's a huge payoff to all this, like these kids band together to save themselves and others as they battle the thrilling malfunctioning robots. By page 200 of 388 pages, the kids finally arrive at the frickin' park. 200 pages of this nonsense. Then for the rest of the book, people just get hurt on rides. There's like a broken bone here and there. Like some guy gets a severe laceration. Then a couple kids get killed on the rides. But the park doesn't even close, and it just keeps things business as usual, which is just weird. I would think if kids get killed in a park, you're probably going to shut down for a few days just to deal with the press. There's a ton of malarkey in this book about Native American curses on the land, and that Rise is receiving his comeuppance for building there. The book's finale is the kids playing laser tag with the runaway robot soldiers who are using real lasers. I hated this book so much. I hated the pace of the book, I hated the plot, I hated the dull and uninspired dialogue between the characters. This book is terrible. I'm sure Wallace has some great books because she was immensely popular, but this book isn't one of them. Stay away from Thrill because it ain't thrilling. And that's the end of my regular portion of the episode. Stick around for my reading of a short story by Stephen Mertz called King of Horror. If you're leaving now, thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channels and follow us on Facebook and X. Be sure to read the blog for new reviews Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and there's tons and tons of stuff in the archives that I routinely repost on social media so you can get a chance to look at it again. All right. So now is The King of Horror, authored by Stephen Mertz. This is the lead story in a book that came out a few years ago under that same title. It was published by Wolfpack. So here we go. I'm the greatest horror writer who ever lived. The tragedy, for me as a professional writer, for you as a reader, is that, more than likely, you've never heard of me. You've heard of Stephen King. You've heard of Clive Barker. You've heard of Dean R. Koontz. Pretenders to the throne, every one of them. And there are too many others like them. Talentless pygmies in a land once ruled by giants like Poe, Lovecraft, Derleth, Bloch, and yours truly, Wrigley Balbo. A prophet without honor in his own country. A man who was cheated and pushed aside by these grubby Johnny-come-lately punks and their million-dollar contracts and their New York Times bestsellers. They went to school reading my stuff. The Cemetery People. The Goblins Are Hungry. Blood on My Hatchet. What did I get out of it? Lousy advances, no reviews, crummy distribution, and even that was years ago. In other words, I got nothing out of it. Nada. Zip. Not a damn thing. Not money. Not fame. Hell, my last book was published 9 years ago in England only. The bastards paid me $400 friggin' dollars for it. And it's never been reprinted since, in England or anywhere else. Pardon me for sounding more than a little bitter, folks, but I'm talking hunger here, and pain, and the indescribable ache of seeing men and women not fit to kiss my platen roller, going after big bucks time after time after time. The only horror about their writing is that they can get away with recycling the same third-rate crap, lifted from old movies, old pulps, old comics, and the work of their betters, foisting it off on a semi-literate public that doesn't know any better. But have any of these jerks ever said a nice word about me in public after they became famous? Have they ever cited me as one of the founding fathers of this genre they've coasted on to the bank? Have they ever helped a tired old pro out by maybe slipping him a few bucks when it could have helped? No, no, and no. Scum, talentless scum, every one of them. Well, there was one who was different. His name was Mark Darby, and his is the last story I want to tell. Or maybe it's my story, I'm not sure. I'm not sure of anything anymore. I'll just tell the story. You decide. He chose a restaurant we'd been to a couple times before when he'd been to New York. One of those places just off Broadway, Midtown, that still has managed to hold off against the closing-in sleaze that's rotted most of that part of Manhattan into something unrecognizable since the days when I and the city were a whole lot younger. Writers rarely run with the pack. We'd set a lunch date for afternoon rush, but a good restaurant in that part of town is rarely empty, even at mid-afternoon. He was waiting for me at a corner table when I walked in. The murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware from nearby tables, and the music the place piped in did nothing to ease the tension that had wrapped my gut into a knot and strangely juxtaposed the ringing in my ears that began when I approached the table. He rose to greet me with that fresh-faced grin of his that the world knew from his book jacket photograph. He must have been about 40 by now, but he could have passed for 10 or 15 years younger than that with no problem. Damn him. There were no stress lines at the corners of his eyes or mouth. No gray in his beard or longish hair. Why should there be? He had the world by the tail. He was dressed casually, but the clothes were expensive, I could tell. I wondered if he noticed how out of style, how threadbare my own jacket, slacks, and shirt were. His handshake was firm and friendly, like his voice. "Rig, damn, it's good to see you again. How the hell have you been?" "Getting by." We ordered a beer for him, scotch on the rocks for me. Then we ordered lunch. He ordered the hamburger steak. I ordered salad. Lunch is usually my main meal of the day, but the knot in my stomach had taken away my appetite. We touched glasses in a silent toast. "Geez, Rig, I'm glad you were able to make it. What's it been like, 4, 5 years?" "Glad I can make it, you sniveling little shit. It's not like I've been balancing an overload social calendar here exactly. More like sitting around waiting for the damn phone to ring." I sipped my drink and was surprised to see that my hand was trembling. Just the tremor, not enough to spill more than a drop. He probably noticed, but he didn't say anything. "I've been wondering how you were doing, kid." I tried to make my voice sound cordial. "I saw your book all over the bestseller list. What was it, 3 years ago? Then nothing?" "I had to cut the world loose for a while." "Still, I didn't figure you'd cut me loose. No one seemed to know what happened to you. I figured you'd stay in touch with me at least. Ever since you wrote me that fan letter 20 years ago, I guess I always thought of us as friends more than just teacher and student. I've got to say, kid, I didn't know what to make of it. It sort of hurt my feelings." "I'm sorry," he said, and he sounded sincere. "My brain blocked after that first book went through the ceiling like it did." "So where have you been?" "Bummed around Europe some, lived on Majorca for a while, fell in and out of love in Paris. I finally hammered another book into shape. I'm in town to deliver it to my agent." "Big bucks, I'll bet, huh?" Let's not get into that, Rig." "Hey, it's okay. I heard about it at a fan convention I went to a couple months back. I still attend the damn things even if I hadn't written in the field in 20 years. Anyway, I heard you pulled down $500,000 for an advance. How does that feel?" "Every page is still a battle. My back still goes out on me. Hemorrhoids still give me help. Not that much has changed." "Yeah, right." "How about you? What are you working on these days?" I shrugged. I polished off my drink. "I'm not working. Why bother? It wouldn't sell." I set the glass back down on the table, maybe a little too hard. "I'm washed up. Or haven't you heard? My career was in the toilet before you left. I can't get work. No agent will handle me. 10 years ago, I made a stink about how they were screwing me on royalty payments, and the bastards blacklisted me. You know that. I need another drink." I ordered another, a double this time. He was still working on his beer. He waited until the waitress and cub had gone before he spoke. "You did piss off and alienate a lot of people," he agreed. "But that was a long time ago. Editors come and go, writers write until they die, and then their work lives forever. You taught me that, remember?" "Yeah, but the blacklist stayed around forever, too. The last 10 years have been tough, Mark, real tough. I can't get arrested on Publishers Row. Rig, every writing career has its ups and downs, its lean stretches. Look at so-called bad boys like Harlan Ellison. He's made a second career out of bad-mouthing crooked publishers, but other houses still publish his stuff. Editors will buy books if they think the books will sell." "Listen, kid, every writer in the world is getting screwed by every publisher in the world. I made an effort to sip my drink, not toss it back the way I wanted to. The tremors had stopped, but not the knot in my stomach or the ringing in my ears. I set the glass down easy this time. So what is it, Mark? Now that you've got a bestseller under your belt and some oversized advances, you're not going to go condescending on me, are you? You're not going to forget where you came from? Don't be mean, Rick. I thought we were friends. I guess I've just had about it up to here with this current crop of so-called brand-name authors. A bunch of what's in it for me, thieves, that's all they are. You'd think I had leprosy at the cons I go to. You can see it in their eyes from across the room. I hope you don't think I feel that way. I couldn't stop the words from spilling out. I was getting drunk. Whiskey on an empty stomach, but I didn't give a shit. They're just showing their true colors, I said. One oversized paycheck and the little boogers actually start to believe that they're better writers. All of a sudden, they're not available when the big issues come up, like getting shafted over royalties or fighting for fair play. Buck the establishment. All of a sudden, they can't be bothered. They can't afford to choose sides or do the right thing. Damn them for the hypocrites they are. I'm sorry to see you like this, man. What the hell did you expect? You know what that blacklist did to my career. An uncomfortable silence. Then the food came. We both ate for a few minutes without saying anything. Then he said quietly, "Are you sure there was a blacklist, Rig? Or were you just making yourself too difficult to do business with?" I'd been forcing myself to eat. I couldn't take another bite. I swallowed and set my fork down next to the half-finished salad. "Who have you been talking to? Of course there was a blacklist. I fought City Hall and I lost. They ran me out on a rail and they never let me back in. Okay, if there wasn't a blacklist, what the hell happened to my career?" Another stretch of silence. He pushed his plate away with most of his hamburger still on it. "This is a hell of a get-together after all these years. Tell me, if it wasn't them, who the hell did this to me?" "It was you, Rig." That caught me off guard. I blinked. "Me?" There was hurt in his eyes. He spoke softly, for no other ears but mine. He said, "You allowed your ego and laziness to grind your talent into dust." "Laziness? After my first few books, I wrote 10 books a year for 10 years. Those were Gothic novels, Rig. Your first 4 horror books were terrific, but when the Gothic boom hit in the 60s and early 70s, you wrote one, and it sold better than your horror stuff, so you took on a pen name and cranked out nothing but from then on. Writers have to eat, and they were good Gothics, heavy on atmosphere with a lot of horror elements. Maybe, but you weren't writing 10 books a year. You were writing the same book 10 times a year for 10 years. Your editors wouldn't have bought that type of book if you tried to break the formula. And I suppose you're not lazy, Mr. 4 years to write a book? Maybe a creative block is laziness, he conceded. I've done formula work for hire when I had to pay the rent, but I know it's a hell of a lot harder to take the time and patience to dig down inside, try to do something different each time out, to try to make yourself a better writer with each book, than just to work the treadmill." He looked across the table, looked me straight in the eye then. "That's the kind of writer you were in the beginning, Rig, and it's the kind of writer you could still be unless your ego precludes you from learning, from creative growth." I wanted to lean across the table and strangle the life out of him right then, but of course that wouldn't do, and I was aware that a few heads had already turned from nearby tables as my last outburst, although they had since returned to minding their own business. Stay cool, I told myself. It won't be long now. "Writing is everything to me," I told him. He shook his head. "Don't give me that," he said, not unkindly. His tone was friendly, in fact. "Your ego is everything to you. You wrote for as long as it came easy, and it came easy because you never struggled to better yourself, only to write faster. When it no longer came easily, you blew up at everyone in sight, the good and the bad, and you threw in the towel." "What the hell do you know about it?" I snapped. "I have a closet full of unpublished manuscripts that I can't give away, and you tell me there was no blacklist? You're forgetting that you let me read some of those manuscripts. The ones I read were sabotaged by every bad habit you picked up over 10 years of writing those trash books. Uncertain point of view, authorial intrusion, ungrammatical as hell. Well, aren't you the authority all of a sudden?" "Not all of a sudden. It took me a long time to learn what good writing is. Damn it, Rig, you spent years turning out faddish, ephemeral junk, and now you're bitter because you're not regarded as a major talent. You want to be a major writer? Write a major book." "Like you did, I suppose." "No, like you did in the beginning. Do what you can already do. Write a page-turner that sends shivers up the spine. That's what your best stuff always did to me. That's why I wrote you that first fan letter all those years ago. Write a book for today's market. And instead of focusing your considerable energies and talent on volume, focus on improving for a change." Listen to you. I tried to keep the snarl out of my voice and failed. Today's market. What you mean is I should turn myself into one of those derivative, bloodless hacks with no sound of their own. Listen, I'm going to outlive and outclass 9/10 of these flash-in-the-pan scribblers. Maybe so, but in the meantime, they're going to the bank and you're in the poorhouse. I felt washed through me the brooding blackness of despair that always alternated with the rage. Don't remind me. I'm almost glad Ginny isn't alive to see what became of me. She used to share my dreams, crazy lady. I'm glad we didn't have kids. I'm a rotten damn failure. It's hard to believe that once upon a time I was so full of dreams and ambition. Oh, I was going to set the world on fire with my typewriter. I was going to be a great entertainer. But after all those books, after all those millions of words, you want to know how I feel now? If you ever wake up surrounded by books and typewriters, you've died and gone to hell. I heard my words taper off, heard the sentence dwindle away, and I didn't want to see the look on Mark Darby's face because I knew I'd see pity and nothing else. I waved down the waitress and ordered another double. The kid passed. He still hadn't finished his beer. The distraction gave me some time to rein in my emotions. Slow down, Rig, I told myself. Slow down, don't lose it. What's going to happen will happen any minute now. I glanced over Darby's shoulder at the glass doors behind him that led to the street. Still no sign of Lester. But he'd been putting in an appearance soon enough. Lester wasn't the type to pull a no-show, not on something like this. Mark Darby may have been my biggest fan once upon a time, and maybe he thought he was my friend, but he didn't know everything about me. Not by a long shot. For starters, he didn't know that I actually had been writing some over the past few years. Some hardcore porn work I'd managed to scare up, and almost as bad, one entry in an action-adventure paperback series before the editor found out who I was. I'd approached the series editor using a pen name for cover, not giving my own name. They paid me a kill fee on that one and never published it. Said it wasn't up to snuff, too purple they called it, overwritten, but I knew better. The blacklist was still in effect. The kill fee was peanuts, but I got something worth a whole lot more out of the experience besides humiliation and rejection. I got Lester. Maybe you know a guy like Lester. They sent him to Vietnam a lifetime ago, and part of him never came back. I met him at my favorite neighborhood tavern about the time I was writing that action-adventure book. You know the kind of book I mean. Big, tough, macho hero saves the world from foreign bad guys and annihilation. Book after book, month after month, all in 192 pages. Real juvenile crap. Anyway, Lester reads that stuff. He's collected all the different series, and we got to be regular drinking buddies after he found out I was working on one. He'd been trained in the special forces, but been bounced around even before the war was over. My guess would be he started liking it too much, but that was one thing he never spoke about. What he did talk about was his guns. He had a regular arsenal in his basement. I saw it once. He talked about all the ways he knew of killing a man, of the satisfaction he had always gotten when he'd taken someone out and it had gone like clockwork. He told me that he missed those days. Of course, I talked some too. I told him about the fair-haired boys who had stolen my place in the sun, had stolen my markets, my readers, my livelihood. I told him about my hatred for the ones who were selling the books that I should have sold instead of getting blacklisted and living off my social security and getting drunk on cheap booze and my festering hatred. One thing led to another. "You'd like to see them dead, wouldn't you, Rig?" he said one night after last call, just before the bartender threw us out. I didn't even have to think about it. "Yeah, I'd like to see them dead, Lester. In the worst way. I dream about it. After what they did to me, I'd love to see them get theirs, every last one of them. I'll do it myself, except I don't have the guts." "Well, I do," he said quietly. At first I thought he was kidding, egging me on, just having fun with the demons and misery of a broken-down old drunk. But he wasn't kidding. He had demons too, and they needed to be satisfied. It turned out as much as mine did. It was as if fate had brought us together, one of those coincidences you're not supposed to use in fiction, but it happens all the time in what we call real life. That was the beginning. We started getting together more regularly. We'd fire our demons with alcohol at the tavern, and then we'd adjourn to his place or mine, where I'd supply the names and the cities where they lived, and he would take considerable time between our meetings to draw up extensive plans for the elimination of each one of them. Contracts, he called them, and none of them would look like murder, he said. One could be a suicide, another would be an accident, another would be made to look like the victim of a burglary. That one would look like murder, of course, but he would ensure that there would be no way either of us could be tied into any of the deaths. The best thing was it wouldn't cost me a cent. Lester looked healthier every time I saw him. He even gave up drinking after the first few planning sessions. It was as if he were born again, or something. I guess his reward would be in knowing that he could still perform at what had once given his life meaning and purpose. Me? I just fell asleep smiling, thinking about it every night. I couldn't stop drinking, and it didn't make me want to write, but revenge would be its own sweet reward. The ones who had stolen from me and built careers on it would be as dead as my career was, and anticipation of that was all I needed. Hell, it was better than writing. It was better than sex. Lester had been a week away from implementing the first contract when I had gotten the unexpected call last night from Darby. I'd lost touch with Mark, but what I felt for the others was even stronger for him because he had written me those glowing fan letters all those years ago. He'd almost literally learned at my knee, and so the hatred I felt for him was more a personal thing. The others had learned from reading my books. That's how they'd stolen from me. Mark Darby had been much more personal about it. Over the years, he'd stolen from my brain, and so his end would be more personal too. I wanted to see him die, unlike with the others. Lester explained that it would be much better if I were nowhere nearby, if I had myself a strong alibi, when those contracts were carried out. But this payback, let's call it, would have to be different, I knew. I'd called Lester and explained all this to him as soon as I'd hung up after getting Darby's call. Lester hadn't skipped a beat. Shouldn't be a problem. They taught us in the berets to adapt and improvise. When do you want me to do it? I guess I was taken aback a little at his readiness and his willingness. How about while he and I are having lunch together, I suggested. But will that work? I mean, it'll be broad daylight. There'll be witnesses. That'll be good for me. They'll know I didn't do it, but what about you? No problem. Lester always spoke briskly when he talked about killing people. A hit in public can be the easiest. A man walks up to the table in a restaurant, blows some guy away. Crazy shit like that happens in New York all the time. But the witnesses, in a situation like that, people are in shock from what they've seen. That's all they see. I come in, I execute this Darby guy, and I run out. No one will try to stop me. Shock, like I said. As many people who witness it, that's how many descriptions the police will get of the killer, and not one of them will be worth a damn. So how will you do it? A gun? A knife? Don't worry about it. Maybe a gun, maybe a knife, maybe something else. The more spectacular, the less anyone will see of me. They'll see the blood and a dead man, and that's all. But there is one thing. What's that? Like you said, Rig, this one will be different from the others because you're going to be there. So? Ever see a man killed before? Not really. It won't be pretty. Just don't get cold feet on me, okay? Once I commit myself to taking someone out, I do it and nothing stops me, understand? I understand. Good. You just meet the guy for lunch and I'll take care of the rest. But if you want to back out, now's the time. Nothing gets in my way, and that includes you. For the minute I walk into that restaurant tomorrow, this guy is dead meat. You try to stop it, and I'll take you out too. I just want that clear between us. Don't worry about it. Nothing will change my mind. In fact, I'm looking forward to it. Not only had nothing changed my mind, but the more time I spent over lunch with Mark Darby, the more I wanted to see this disrespectful creep get his. I had to work to keep my eyes from wandering to the street entrance. It would be better if it came as a surprise to me when it did happen, I told myself. It would look better that way. I sipped my drink and watched him over the rim of the glass. I realized he was saying something, that my attention had drifted. He didn't have a clue to what my thoughts had been. How could he? The smug bastard would never guess in a million years, and all he had left was a few more minutes at most. You're right, Rig, he was saying in a gentler tone than before. I did learn from reading you when I was a kid, and so did a lot of other writers who are hot today. Well, there you are, I managed to say. Filthy thieves. But learning isn't stealing, he said. And we learn from reading hundreds of other writers, too. And if some of the writers in my age group do appear to be condescending toward you at times, it may be because we've continued to learn and grow as writers over the years, and you haven't. Bullshit. Not bullshit, Rig. You do need to improve your work. You should want to. Every writer needs to, and for you a big start would be just to go back to being as good as you were in the beginning. You can do that. You can become a modern stylist. Those first novels of yours are exactly what editors are looking for today. But it was as if at some point early on you decided you'd learned enough. I couldn't help myself. My eyes shifted over his shoulder again to the door. Come on, Lester, I thought. Come on. The ringing in my ears was growing louder. So thanks for the post-mortem, I said. So why are you wasting your time? What is this? Talented student gives mentor a pep talk? So you're like all the others after all. Rig, you have to stop blaming everyone else. You're deluding yourself. Why don't you fix the blame where it belongs and everything else could just fall into place? God knows the world is a far from perfect place, and that sure does include the writing profession and the publishing industry. You're right, they are shark-infested waters. So I'm right. Only about that, but that can't be an excuse for everything you've let happen to yourself. Your biggest enemies are your ego and your inability to adapt. Adapt and improvise, eh? Exactly. Cut through that and you can be 3 times the writer you ever were. No one can make a page sing the way you did when you're in top form. Get your act together and we'll do business. That threw me for a loop. Business? I haven't been hammering at you like this for fun. See, Rig, I'm not like the others, and you're wrong about most of them. I'm taking a big chunk of that last advance I paid, and I'm going into the publishing business myself. You're what? I don't know. It's just something I've always wanted to do. Maybe for some of the reasons you've stated about what's wrong with the industry. I want to do it right. I've hired one of the best editors in town. He was talking faster now, bubbling in rising spirits. I control the purse strings, and I want to give you your chance. Just this week I reread The Cemetery People. Hadn't read that one since I was a kid, and you know what? It's absolutely bowled me over. That was one of my masterpieces, I admitted. I'd forgotten all about watching The Glass Doors. I do owe you for what you've given me, Rig, he said. When I was a kid, your writing helped make me want to be a writer. When I started writing and I contacted you, you encouraged me, and your books have entertained me through the years. I even read those lame Gothics you wrote. I'm still a fan. I've reread some of your old books several times. I want to pay some of that back if I can. You do the same for me. What are you saying, kid? I'm saying that if you'll get your act together, I mean really together, if you'll write a book for today's market, free of cliche and the other problems we've discussed, if you'll really go back to being the king of horror, then I'll see to it that my editor buys that book from you and that it's published. All I'm asking for is the blockbuster I know you've got in you. I'll see to it that you get a top dollar advance on acceptance with a major promo budget, and I'll want to reprint some of that great old stuff too. I don't know what to say, was all I could manage. Please say yes, Rig, and please don't screw up this chance I'm giving you. I didn't have time to reply to that. I saw Lester come in from the street looking straight ahead. His face was like I'd never seen it before, like a mask carved in granite. He saw us and started straight for the table. His eyes were on the back of Mark's head, and he was reaching for something in his pocket. So there you go, The King of Horror by Stephen Mertz. It's funny reading the story, but Stephen Mertz was probably my very first author that I really got into as far as adult fiction, like men's action adventure, paperbacks. I remember as a kid, my dad and my mom took me to a used bookstore. I saw M.I.A. Hunter on the shelves. At the time, I was into Missing in Action with Chuck Norris. I was into the Rambo movies. My dad had served in Vietnam. A bunch of my family members were in Vietnam, so I heard all the military stories around the dinner table sometimes on a Sunday. So I gravitated towards those books, and Stephen Mertz was the man behind the pen. He was the one writing that stuff, and he was the guy. I remember writing, as I've said on this podcast before, I remember writing book reports on the M.I.A. Hunter books in English class, and I would turn in the book reports, and my teacher was like, I don't know what, what you're reading. I don't know if these are good for you, but you've certainly got passion for writing and for reading, and she always gave me 100, which I used for extra credit because I wasn't very good at English class. But those books helped me get kind of over the hump and pass English based off of my book reports of Stephen Mertz's literary work in the men's action adventure field. But this interesting story is, I guess, sort of Mertz's love letter, I guess, in a way, or maybe not a love letter, to the writing industry and some of the things that he's probably experienced in his career from early on, writing in like Mike Shane Mystery Magazine and writing all those action adventure novels. Honestly, I mean, he'll probably tell you too, getting passed around from publisher to publisher, looking for that big next advance. And I think he's pretty happy with his literary career. He's made a great go of it, put out a ton of great books. He's got Wolfpack Publishing behind him now. He's got great editors. He's got a great company behind him. And I know he's churning out about a book a year, maybe even more than one book a year. And he's happy. He's writing. He's behind the typewriter, what he calls the book factory. And man, I got to meet him one time. My family and I spent some time with him out in Arizona, and genuine one of the most happiest people on earth. Just happy to be alive, happy to write books, write stories, be behind the typewriter. And he's just a great guy to just reach out to. He's very approachable. He'll talk to you about writing, talk to you about books, talk to you about the price of peanuts in China. So just a great guy. This was a great story. It meant a lot to me. I read it a few years ago, and it's one of those stories that just relates so well to the publishing industry. It says so much in 22 pages. Anyway, Stephen Mertz, The King of Horror and Other Stories. Just flipping through here, you've got Introduction by Ben Bolden. You've got The King of Horror story that I just read to you. You've got some other great stories, The Death Blues, Fragged, Talon's Gift. You've got The Lizard Men of Blood River. That's a kind of a fun, pulpy story. The Busy Corpse, Take Two, The Basics of Murder, The Dark of Midnight, Last Stand, A Hit for the New Age. Probably, my French is bad. Che Erotica, I'm not sure how to say that. Ches Erotic. Eagle Park Slim. And then you've got an afterword and then a preview of Stephen Mertz's Dragonfire, Cody's War Book 1, which he's had a lot of success with the Cody's War books. And then about the author. So pick this book up. It's great, and you can get it through Amazon and so forth, or you can just go to Wolfpack Publishing and see the links there. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you enjoyed the feature, the review, and that story that I just read to you. And I'll be back here in 2 weeks to do it again. Hope you have a great rest of whatever you're doing. Bye-bye.